Good day, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a great day wherever you're watching from. Today, we'll explore a story that begins with a single frozen signal on a phone screen and spirals into a silent, high-stakes rescue that no one saw coming. What if finding the person you love is only the beginning of something far more dangerous? Stay with us because this story doesn't end with the rescue. It's where the real mystery starts. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. James was sitting alone in his car when he noticed something that immediately felt wrong. On his phone screen, the location signal tied to Tu Diep's phone had stopped moving. Not just paused for a few minutes, but frozen in place for far too long, right in the middle of a remote, nearly abandoned area. At first, he told himself not to overreact. Bad reception maybe, a dead battery. Any normal explanation would have been comforting, but the longer he stared at the unmoving dot on the map, the tighter his chest felt. He tried calling her, once, twice, again and again. Each call rang for a few seconds before cutting off. No voicemail, no answer, just silence. That silence was louder than any alarm. James leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The concern on his face didn't explode into panic. Instead, it hardened. His expression shifted, subtle, controlled, into something colder and far more dangerous. This was the look of someone who had been through real threats before, someone who knew the difference between coincidence and intention. This wasn't an accident. In his mind, the pieces began to line up. Tu Diep wouldn't stop in a place like that without a reason. She wouldn't ignore his calls, and the timing felt too precise to be random. Whatever had happened, it was deliberate. Someone had taken control of the situation, and of her. James started the engine. As he drove closer to the area marked on the map, he slowed down instinctively. The road narrowed, trees closing in on both sides, swallowing what little light remained. He muted his phone completely. No vibrations, no sounds. From a distance, he turned off his headlights, letting the car roll forward under the cover of darkness. The GPS confirmed what he already suspected. Tu Diep's signal was coming from an old, abandoned structure hidden deep within the forest, the kind of place no one visited anymore. The kind of place people chose precisely because no one would look there. James didn't call for backup. He didn't alert the authorities. Not yet. He knew that involving too many people too quickly could tip someone off. If this was a kidnapping, the worst thing he could do was make noise. So he chose silence. His breathing slowed, each inhale steady, each exhale controlled. Fear was there, yes, but locked away, tightly managed. Every step of this had to be calculated. One wrong move could put Tu Diep in even more danger. Inside the abandoned building, Tu Diep sat on the cold floor in the corner of a dark room. Her hands were bound tightly, her mouth covered just enough to silence her, but not enough to suffocate her. Whoever had done this wanted her alive and quiet. She forced herself to stay calm. Her heart was racing, but she didn't let panic take over. Instead, she listened. Footsteps, voices in the distance, the sound of someone moving in another room. She paid attention to patterns, to timing, to anything that might matter later. Her phone had been taken from her, but she knew something they didn't. The battery wasn't dead, and the location tracking was still on. That small detail was the thin thread she clung to. Fear flickered in her eyes, but it didn't consume her. Beneath it was something stronger, trust. James would notice. He always did. And once he noticed, he wouldn't stop until he found her. Outside, James parked the car far enough away to avoid being seen or heard. He moved on foot from there, every step deliberate. From a concealed position, he watched the building for a long time. Too long for anyone impatient. He studied the surroundings, memorized the rhythm of movement inside. The people holding Tu Diep were careless. They believed they were hidden well enough. No guards outside, no serious security measures, just confidence, born from the assumption that no one would ever find this place. That assumption was their mistake. James spotted a side entrance, an old wooden window, warped by time and rot. It looked fragile, unstable. More importantly, it looked quiet. Carefully, he tested it, applying just enough pressure. The wood shifted with a faint creak, but not enough to carry. He waited, counted seconds. No reaction. Slowly, he slipped inside. Every movement was economical. No wasted steps. No unnecessary sounds. His focus was absolute. As he edged closer to the inner rooms, he caught sight of her through a narrow opening. Tu Diep, bound, exhausted, but awake. For just a fraction of a second, James froze. A rush of emotion surged through him. Pain, anger, guilt, all colliding at once. He hated seeing her like this. Hated himself for not getting there sooner, but that moment passed as quickly as it came. He couldn't afford it. His face went still again, composed, unreadable. When Tu Diep finally noticed him, her eyes widened. But before she could react, James lifted a hand, signaling her to stay silent. She nodded. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that look, there was trust, complete and unshaken. James waited for the right moment. The voices moved farther away. A door closed somewhere down the hall. This was it. He entered the room soundlessly, moving straight to her side. His hands worked quickly, expertly, loosening the restraints while keeping one hand ready to steady her if she lost balance. When the bindings fell away, Tu Diep trembled, not from pain, but from the sudden release of tension. James held her hand firmly, grounding her. His eyes met hers, calm and reassuring. It's okay. They moved together, retracing the path James had already mapped out in his head, step by step, breath by breath. They slipped back into the darkness, unseen, unheard. Inside the building, life went on as usual. Laughter, movement. No one noticed that their captive was already gone. By the time they reached the car, James locked the doors and started the engine without hesitation. The vehicle rolled forward smoothly, disappearing into the night. On the map, the location dot began to move again, but no one was watching. Only when they were far enough away did Tu Diep finally break. Silent tears streamed down her face, her body shaking as the fear she had been holding back finally surfaced. James said nothing. He reached over, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have protected you better." Tu Diep tightened her grip on his hand. She was alive. She was free. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Behind them, in the abandoned building, the empty chair remained in the corner. The neatly cut bindings lay on the floor, a quiet warning that someone dangerous had intervened. And the story was far from over. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, swallowed by darkness, the car's engine humming low and steady. James kept both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed forward, but his awareness never left Tu Diep. She sat quietly beside him, her breathing uneven, fingers still clenched tightly around his hand as if letting go might pull her back into that room. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, loaded with everything they didn't yet have words for. Fear that had barely missed becoming tragedy, relief that still felt unreal, and beneath it all, a growing realization that this wasn't over. Tu Diep was the first to break the quiet. "They didn't think anyone would find me," she said softly, her voice still unsteady. "They were careless, too confident." James nodded, his jaw tightening. People like that always are. He didn't ask her what they wanted. Not yet. He didn't want to force her back into that moment while her hands were still trembling. For now, all that mattered was distance. Every mile between them and that building felt like reclaiming something stolen. As the forest thinned and the road opened up, James finally allowed himself to slow down. The danger of immediate pursuit was gone. No headlights behind them, no sudden turns. Just empty road and the low glow of the dashboard. Tu Diep leaned back against the seat, exhaustion washing over her. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was fading fast. James noticed instantly. "We'll stop soon," he said. "Somewhere safe." She nodded, trusting him completely. They pulled into a quiet roadside area a short while later. James turned off the engine but left the interior light on. For the first time since finding her, he really looked at her, checked for injuries, bruises, anything he might have missed in the rush. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice controlled but tight around the edges. "Nothing serious," she replied. "Just scared." That was when the weight finally hit him. James leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I should have seen it coming," he said quietly. "The signs were there. I just didn't connect them fast enough." Tu Diep shook her head. "You found me. That's what matters." But James wasn't convinced. In his mind, this wasn't a success. It was a warning. Someone had been watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. And now they knew exactly how close they'd come. After giving her time to rest, James started the car again. This time, he headed toward a place he knew well, a safe location, away from the city, away from familiar routines, somewhere no one would think to look. As they drove, Tu Diep began to talk. Slowly at first. She described fragments, voices she didn't recognize, the way they avoided names, how careful they were not to leave anything behind. No demands, no explanations, just containment. "They weren't in a hurry," she said, like they were waiting for something else to happen. That detail unsettled James more than anything else. When they finally arrived, dawn was just beginning to break. Pale light crept over the horizon, revealing a quiet, secluded house surrounded by trees. James helped Tu Diep inside, locking every door behind them before finally allowing himself to breathe. Inside, the world felt still, safe, almost normal. Tu Diep sat down, wrapping her hands around a warm cup of water James handed her. The simple act grounded her, brought her back. "You saved me," she said, looking up at him. James didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, watching the outside, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. "For now," he said. But whoever did this didn't make a single mistake by accident. They wanted control. They wanted time. "And now they've lost it," Tu Diep said. "Or changed tactics," James replied. That was when it truly sank in for both of them. The rescue hadn't ended the danger. It had only shifted it. Hours later, after Tu Diep finally fell asleep, James sat alone, his phone in hand. He replayed everything in his head, from the frozen dot on the map to the empty chair in that dark room. Every detail mattered now. He began making quiet calls, not to the authorities, not yet, to people he trusted, people who understood discretion. Each conversation was short, carefully worded, enough to start pulling threads without revealing the whole picture. By the time the sun was fully up, James had reached a conclusion. This wasn't random. It was connected to the past, to secrets that had never fully stayed buried. Someone believed Tu Diep was the key to something, and now, by taking her back, James had put himself directly in their line of sight. When Tu Diep woke later that morning, she found James already waiting. "We need to be careful," he told her. "From now on, nothing is normal. No routines, no assumptions." She studied his face. "You think they'll try again?" "I know they will," he said. "But next time, We'll be ready." She didn't hesitate. "Then we face it together." James nodded. That was never in question. Somewhere else, far from the quiet house, the abandoned building was finally discovered to be empty. The people responsible stood in the room where Tu Diep had been held, staring at the severed bindings on the floor. No panic, no shouting, just silence. One of them spoke at last. "So, he found her." Another voice answered calmly. "That was always a possibility." "What now?" A pause. "Now," the voice said, "we move faster." Back at the house, James looked out at the trees swaying gently in the morning light. He knew the calm wouldn't last, but he also knew something else now. They had crossed a line, and once crossed, there was no turning back. This was no longer just about rescue, it was about uncovering the truth, no matter how dangerous it turned out to be. James notices Tu Diep's phone location frozen in a remote area and realizes she has been taken deliberately. Following the signal in total silence, he tracks it to an abandoned building hidden in the forest. Inside, Tu Diep is bound but calm, relying on the still active tracker and her trust in James. Observing patiently, James exploits the kidnapper's carelessness, enters through a decayed side window, and reaches her without being detected. He frees Tu Diep quietly, and together they escape along a pre-planned route, while the captors remain unaware. Safe in the car, Tu Diep finally breaks down, and James apologizes for failing to protect her. At a secluded hideout, they understand the danger is not over. The kidnapping was calculated, tied to buried secrets, and rescuing Tu Diep has placed James directly in the enemy's sight once again now.